Welcome to the podcast, Restore Yourself, Restore Your Marriage, where it's all about discovering the thoughts that get you in the mood, the thoughts that get you out of the mood, and how creating a deeper connection with yourself creates a deeper connection with your spouse. I'm your coach, Shelly Anderson, coaching you through life, love, and intimacy. This is episode number 173, How to Handle Communication Frustration. Yes, this is so important because let's think about it. We're all communicating all the time, just in different ways. Sometimes it's verbally with the words that we're saying. Sometimes it's with our tone. Sometimes it's with our body language or the lack of body language or the lack of certain words or the lack of speaking sentences. We're always communicating. And I find it very fascinating when couples come to me and they want to communicate and they understand that they are actually struggling to communicate effectively. And sometimes they will say, hey, we're trying to communicate, we're actually sitting down, we're having conversations, we're not being mean to one another. But for some reason, it's not working. It's not landing right. Something is still missing and not working quite as well as it should. And I love this, especially when couples even say, hey, we're both trying. We're both smart enough to understand that we're going to try to speak clearly and intellectually. And yet, if we're both smart enough and we're both willing, why is this so hard? Why is this not working? And the answer is really simple. It's because we are not taught communication skills growing up, right? And what we are taught is just by usually what we've seen and grown up with. It could be from the media, it could be from our immediate family, it could be culture, it could be from, our friends who we spend time with. And so we have a lot of different formats of communication that we're picking up on. And sometimes when we like a certain type of communication and it resonates with us, then we'll tend to just maybe go with that style, and we will be willing to listen more when someone else communicates in that style. And so what ends up happening is that everyone is working on very different levels of communication, very different methodologies of communication, and they're usually not anywhere on the same page. So this is why communication is so crazy. It's so hard to make that connection where what is being expressed is actually understood in the way that it was meant to be understood. And so we all have different thoughts and ideas about communication. But the problem is that they're all different. And sometimes what we think is actually good communication might not actually be good communication. A lot of times what I see is passive aggressiveness. People who communicate passive aggressively, they think that that is very effective communication because they're never raising their voice, let's say, or they're never making a critical comment. And while those two things are very helpful for communication, it doesn't necessarily mean that the words that are being spoken are effective at all. So everyone's operating from their own thoughts about what they think is good and effective communication. And sadly and unfortunately, those are all just thoughts. They are all assumptions that their way is the most effective way to communicate. And so what ends up happening is nobody gets on the same page with communication at all. And this shows up in marriage. So we end up having two spouses that are very frustrated with communication, even though they may have the heart in the right place to be putting forth that effort to communicate. So if we are not on the same page and using an effective method or system of communication, there is going to be miscommunication. Like, we can plan on that. We can count on it. So the goal is to try to get couples to say, hey, this is the way to communicate that is effective. There are skills and tools, but then there's also a system. If you follow a system to communicate, yes, we are going to have very effective communication. So we want to move away from some of the old thoughts that we have in our own mind about what we think is good communication. And a lot of times we think that we need to communicate with our spouse to convince them, right? To get them over to our side to do something our way because we believe our way is the right way. And a lot of times when we go into addressing something and having a conversation with our spouse, it's to try to get to some type of solution or resolution. And that usually means we're going to end up communicating in opposites and in polarities, like this is a good thing and this is a bad thing. I'm doing the good thing and you're doing the bad thing. I'm doing the right thing, you're doing the wrong thing. I want you to agree with what I'm saying and we're going to disagree with what you're saying. So what we want to do is really start to think about communication and say, well, what if communication is not really about these polarities, right? It's not my way or your way or my way or the highway, or it's not about just saying what's right and wrong or good and bad all the time. What if that's not really the goal of communication, especially in marriage and in a relationship, right? Because there are going to be times that the wife is right and when the wife is wrong. And there's also going to be times where the husband is right and also when the husband is wrong. So what if the goal is not to always say, like, let's see who's right and wrong, but we shift the purpose of communication to a completely new paradigm, a new way, a new mindset, and say, let's move away from all this right or wrong, because that's going to put us in a lot of blame and negative thinking about our spouse. And that's going to contribute to even more negative communication. But what if we just look at communication in a completely new way, and that the purpose of communication is something new that we have never even thought about before? That is a game changer. That is the shift that we need to make when it comes to communication. We need to move away from all of this polarity and say, hey, maybe the point of communication is to provide me on a personal level with something new to think about so that I can expand my thinking skills, so that I can grow as a human by being able to communicate with all kinds of people, not just communicate with the limited number of people that might communicate in the same way as me, but the way I can grow and develop and progress as a person is being able to communicate with all kinds of people, who some are going to be similar, but the vast majority will be different than me. That is growth and expansion as a human being. Right? Can you imagine if we stayed stuck as toddlers and could only communicate the way that we communicated when we were 3 and throwing temper tantrums to get our way? Wow, the world would be in total chaos. As we grow in age, we are to also grow in wisdom and maturity and skill. That is the goal of humankind, not to stay exactly the same. When we are stuck, we feel depressed. So what we want to do is not stay stuck, even when it comes to communication. We want to progress. We want to move forward. We want to develop skills that make us a better communicator. It's amazing the experience and how we will feel when we're able to level up and skill up in communication. So, what would be the goals for communication? It would be able to listen to all kinds of people and to be able to talk to all kinds of people. It's so that we can be flexible, so that we can expand as a human being, right? I love this type of goal because this is not dependent on whether our spouse is right or wrong. It's communication is for our own progress, right? Now, there are definite goals in communication with our spouse, and we can go into that at another time. And I definitely dive into this in my courses because I love this. I love the concept of communication. It's so amazing. And it doesn't have to be so hard. But if we don't know what to do, it feels very hard and very big and very overwhelming. So our goal is to expand ourselves as far as communication goes, not demand other people limit their communication to be able to communicate with us. We want to grow and develop. And in the process, we can help others grow and develop in their communication, including our spouse. This means we should be able to communicate with people who come from different cultures than us, different upbringings, people who have different political beliefs, people who have different religious beliefs, people who grow up in all different kinds of family formats. We want to be able to communicate with all kinds of people. If we find that communication with our spouse is challenging, it's because we're operating from a very limited style of communication. And we want our spouse to leave their styles behind and only adopt ours. And that's very limiting. And so we will become very limited as a person if that's our goal. We want to expand our skills, expand our abilities so that we become a more effective communicator. When we're limited, our skill and our ability to be a good communicator is limited. So we want to expand that. Another goal of good communication would be to become triggerless. If you are starting to understand good communication skills and are adopting some of the effective communication skills, you will come to find out that you will not be easily offended. So I want that to be a clue to you. If you are easily offended by things that people are saying and doing, it could be that your communication skills need to be leveled up. We need to move up in our ability to listen effectively, to think effectively about what other people are saying, and to not make it mean something negative about ourselves. If people are talking and expressing their opinions and their thoughts and their points of view, and we are taking offense to all of it, it means that we have a very limited filter, a very limited processor of how we are interpreting. Did I say that right? Interpreting? Oh my gosh. How other people are saying things. It's limited. And we need to expand that. So pay attention to how easily offended you are. And if you are, then know that that's a clue that there is more to be developed in our thinking skills and in our communication skills. And the other goal with considering communication is that this is a form of self-care when it comes to the social part of who we are as humans. We're meant to be social. And if we are saying, hey, spouse, you can only communicate in my way, what usually that means is that we have limited our communication to only our spouse, which means we're probably not spending time with our friends, which allows for a higher variety and degree of different forms of communication. And so we're putting a ton of weight and pressure and expectations for our spouse to be the only person we communicate. They're supposed to listen and take in all the stuff that we are going through and handle all of it and solve all of it and respond the way that we want them to. And that is a lot to put onto another person, especially our spouse. And if we think about it, If our spouse hasn't learned effective communication and then we pile all of that on top of it, that is going to feel very frustrating. And it's going to feel like, oh my gosh, I don't even know what to do with all this. This is too big of a problem to be able to handle all this and then to communicate it effectively. And so that leads us to operate from a place of kind of like hopelessness. And that will lead us to probably communicate in ways that are more ineffective. So you can see that this creates cycles that don't help us move forward and keep us stuck in these negative communication cycles. Now, we want to make sure that we are keeping a social life so that we do have other forms of communication outlets. Like this is so true for both men and women. Men, being around your guy friends allows you to communicate in your natural form, right? It's awesome. It's fun. You guys can banter and tease and do all these awesome things that make you feel very connected to your guy friends. Same thing for women. When we're able to share like what we're going through and explain it in multiple different ways, like that's our natural form. And it's amazing to be able to do that with other women. So we need to make sure that we are spending time and putting that social aspect into our schedule to hang out with our friends so that our natural form of communication is fully engaged. And then when it comes to our spouse and the marriage relationship, we're going to say, hey, we're going to use a very specific methodology so that when we're discussing things that need attention, it is going to be effective. So can you see how we can really use all different types of communication in our lives, and they can all serve their own purposes and functions? And this is a very beautiful thing. Very, very beautiful. So make sure you look at your schedule and make sure that there is time set aside for you to be surrounded by your friends. That is going to be important for good communication in your marriage. Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, before we go into some ideas on what to do about this, I want to point out something that comes up when we talk about communication that we may not have realized actually comes up as an issue. And this is the concept of time. Time works very interestingly when it comes to communication. A lot of times men, because they're like, I am the problem solver, I am the provider of the family, I need to get things done. They want communication to function in a way that is efficient. And often how they view efficient communication is short and to the point, not long, not drawn out, not repetitive. Now, a lot of times when they start to express this, the wife is going to be bothered by this because it is not her natural form of communication. What we want to do is flip the script here a little bit, right? And say, okay, it's neither good or bad, right? But this is an opportunity to look at communication through a completely different lens and say, what does this mean for me? And ask ourselves, how can I increase my communication skills in a short amount of time? How can I better express the message with the least amount of words, right? Like this is a new challenge. And I think for women, we're going to need this challenge, but to look at it not as, oh, I have to communicate in my husband's format, right? That's not the point. But to say, man, I can be a more effective communicator with a lot of people in the world if I'm able to learn the skill of communicating succinctly with a few sentences, because that is going to reach a lot of people. Sometimes when we're communicating, it is very valuable to go into explanations of things, But our brain is not going to be able to remember all this, even for people who are very engaged in those kinds of conversations. So being able to have a summary in one sentence that's super effective and easy to remember, like a mantra, can be brilliant for effective communication between husband and wife. So this creates an opportunity, like a challenge for the women, for the wives to say, you know what? I have all these things that I want to explain. And if we were to sit down, this is going to take 2 hours. Your husband is not going to remember all that. And most women aren't going to remember all those details. So we can take all that and say, you know what? If I want this to actually be effective, how can I get this into a mantra? Right? This is a new type of communication for women. This expands the way we communicate, and it will make our communication with our spouse more effective. Now let's look at the opposite side. For husbands, we're like, they don't want to sit down and listen to their wives dump for 2 hours, because then they're like, I don't know what she's really looking for at the end of that. Am I supposed to solve it? Am I supposed to comfort her? Am I supposed to just console her? Am I supposed to fix? They don't know what the goal is. And so all the details that you're giving are kind of floating off into several different directions, because they don't have a solid idea of what the goal is in them listening. And they want to listen, but they can't grasp all the details and put them in the correct categories. Right. And so they're also very overwhelmed by the idea of sitting down and talking for 2 hours, because they don't know if they're going to be effective. They want so badly to be effective, but they don't know if they're going to be effective. And so I want to give the husbands a challenge, just like I gave the wife a challenge to try to come up with a mantra that is succinct, because that makes them become a better communicator. I want to give the husbands a challenge too, that you can either ask a question to your wife for clarity, like, hey, what do you need from me from this conversation, right? Do you need me to help you solve something? Or do you need me to just totally validate what you're going through to support you, right? You can ask that question. If you're not ready to ask that question, sometimes husbands don't want to. There's one more thing you can do, and I want to challenge you with this, is to respond by saying this: man, I don't know how you handle all that. I don't know how you're managing all this. I don't know how you're dealing with this. I give you credit for that, right? Because that is the joining that your wife is probably looking for without you having to solve everything. Usually if your wife wants you to solve something, she's going to say, what do you think I could do about that? She'll ask you. But if you're able to just say, I don't know how you're doing all that, there is something very soothing about that sentence that a wife will usually appreciate. So I just gave each spouse one challenge of something more effective to do with communication to help it move forward in the right direction. But what I really want to do, and this is how we're going to close out this episode, is actually give you a new solution. Now, this isn't going to be like deep methodology or anything like that, but I want to give you 2 sentences that you can use that are just fabulous for the brain and for the heart when it comes to communication. And these sentences have nothing to do with agreeing with your spouse and saying they're right or wrong or anything like that. It is going to be about being agreeable as a spouse, not agreeable in theory or concept, but agreeable in personality and in moving the communication and the relationship forward, right? So this is going to be a way to express your gratitude for the process of communication in and of itself, and for the opportunity it gives you to expand as a person, expand in your skills. Now, this is amazing, right? We don't think about communication in this way as a way to expand as a human being. So here we go. Here are the 2 sentences I want you to try to really focus on this week. I want to challenge you to use these this week. Okay. When your spouse shares something with you, whether it's positive, negative, confrontational, good, bad, agreeable, disagreeable, right or wrong, whatever, I want you to thank them. Thank you for sharing that, right? Because immediately you haven't said something that is combative. You haven't said they're right or wrong, which would just put them on the defense and make communication after that even worse. You're just thanking them for communicating, for expressing, for being willing to share. Thank them. Thank you for sharing that. This is a beautiful sentence. Beautiful. The second sentence is this: you've given me an opportunity to expand my thinking. Oh, yes. Again, this doesn't say that what your spouse said was right or wrong, good or bad, positive, negative, none of those things. You're not agreeing with them. You're not disagreeing with them. You're telling them that they've given you an opportunity to actually grow and progress, to expand your thinking skills. And you're thanking them for that. You're thanking them and you're telling them the gift that they've given you. This is a beautiful thing to express in communication. Now, when you've heard what they've said and you've been able to respond with these two sentences, now you can take the things that they've said, and if you do disagree with them, you can start applying thinking skills that you learn in coaching, that you can learn with me, that you can learn in my courses, and you can start using them, right? Without being offended, without being mad, you can just start processing them in a way that is healthy and effective. But you haven't broken down communication by saying these two sentences. You've actually expanded it and kept it moving forward in a way that feels very good, very nurturing for the relationship. Now, I love talking about communication. It's one of my goals in life is to be able to help couples communicate effectively, not just communicate, because that doesn't mean it's effective, but to communicate effectively. I'm absolutely obsessed with it. So on my website, Shelly.andersoncoaching.com, there's two freebies that are available to you that actually help with communication. One is a PDF that you can print. It's called Bedroom Talk Essentials. And that's kind of like taking it into the bedroom, talking about sex topics that sometimes we've never even talked about. And it gives you some ideas. And then the other one is a video that's how to hear your spouse better. Another approach to being a good listener. And do you know if you are a good listener? Because if you're a good listener, man, that is the skill that you get to develop yourself. You don't get to demand it of others. You get to increase your own skill. You get to level up and say, I'm an awesome listener. I'm a badass listener. And my spouse is going to love that. Like they're going to appreciate it. And I have that skill. So those two freebies allow you to level up and to skill up. Okay, so this week, I hope you will take on these challenges that I've given you, these examples, very specific and concrete examples, and that hopefully you'll be able to apply these two sentences, and you can use them with anyone and everyone, right? Start using these two sentences throughout this week so that you can improve your effectiveness in communication. Because remember, the more you restore this type of intimacy with yourself, the more you restore it with your spouse. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you will join me again next week.